The photograph sat in a dusty corner of the Blackwood Historical Society archives for decades before I found it. I'm Dr. Eleanor Reeves, historical archivist specializing in early 20th century American photography. What started as routine research for my book on domestic workers in the Gilded Age would become the most disturbing investigation of my career. The image was unmistakably from 1906, based on the sepia tone and cabinet card format. It showed the interior of a wealthy Boston mansion, the Harrington Estate, on Beacon Hill, according to the faded inscription. The family stood posed in their Sunday best, father stern in his three-piece suit, mother seated with perfect posture, 3 children arranged by height, standard fare for the era. But at the edge of the frame stood a young maid, perhaps 14 or 15, in a crisp uniform. While the family gazed at some middle distance, as was customary in photography of the time, the maid stared directly into the camera. Her eyes seemed unnaturally focused, piercing through time itself. Something about her gaze made my skin crawl. Who was she? I wondered aloud, turning the photograph over. The back listed the family members meticulously: Edward Harrington, 42, Elizabeth Harrington, 38, William, 17, James, 14, Victoria, 8. No mention of the maid. Find anything interesting? My research assistant, Marcus, peered over my shoulder. Maybe, I said, sliding the photo into a protective sleeve. I need to know more about this maid. That evening, I cross-referenced census records from 1900 and 1910. The Harringtons appeared in both, listing 2 servants in 1900 and 3 in 1910. Names, ages, places of birth, all documented. But none matched the approximate age of the girl in the photograph. I dug deeper into the Harrington family records, payroll ledgers, personal correspondence, anything that might mention domestic staff. Nothing. It was as if this particular maid had never officially existed. Maybe she was temporary help, Marcus suggested, when I shared my findings the next day, or worked off the books. I shook my head. The Harringtons were notoriously meticulous. Their records account for every penny spent on household expenses. Even temporary staff would be documented. Something wasn't adding up. The maid's uniform was too fine for a day worker. It was the formal attire of a permanent household staff member, and her placement in the family portrait suggested importance. As I stared at the photograph again, those eyes looking directly at the camera, I felt a chill run down my spine. The longer I looked, the more convinced I became. The expression in those eyes wasn't just unusual for period photography. It contained something else, something like a warning. I need to visit the Harrington estate, I told Marcus, unable to shake the feeling that this image held secrets waiting to be uncovered. What I couldn't have known then was that my academic curiosity would lead me down a rabbit hole of unexplained disappearances, whispered rumors of unusual activities in the Harrington household, and the disturbing fate of young women who worked in Boston's wealthiest homes during that era. The maid with no name had a story, and somehow, across the divide of over a century, she seemed determined that I should be the one to tell it. The Harrington estate had survived the century remarkably intact, transformed into a museum celebrating Boston's Gilded Age. I arrived early Tuesday morning, armed with my credentials and the mysterious photograph. "We're honored to have you, Dr. Reeves," said the curator, Mrs. Winters, a grey-haired woman with wire-rimmed glasses. "Your work on domestic servitude during the Industrial Revolution is required reading for our docents." I thanked her and produced the photograph. "I'm researching this particular image from 1906. Specifically, I'm interested in identifying the young maid." Mrs. Winters studied the photograph, her expression shifting subtly. "How curious. I've catalogued every Harrington family photograph in our collection. I've never seen this one." "It was in the Historical Society archives," I explained. "Unmarked, except for the date and family identification on the back," She pointed to the spot where the maid stood. The Harringtons were known to employ primarily Irish immigrants, occasionally Swedish. But this girl, she squinted. Something about her features suggests neither. That's part of what intrigues me, I said. I found no record of her employment in any Harrington document. Mrs. Winters pursed her lips. I can give you access to our private archives. Perhaps there's something we've overlooked. The museum's research room was climate-controlled and smelled of old paper and wood polish. Mrs. Winters provided stacks of leather-bound ledgers, journals, and correspondence boxes. Hours into my search, I found something peculiar, a gap in the household expense records spanning 3 months in 1906, precisely when the photograph was taken. Every Harrington ledger was meticulous, with daily entries spanning decades. Yet here was an unexplained absence. Did the family travel during this period? I asked Mrs. Winters. She checked the family calendar logs. No, they remained in Boston that entire year. Edward was managing a significant banking expansion. As the afternoon waned, I discovered a leather-bound journal belonging to Elizabeth Harrington. Most entries detailed social engagements and household management, but a passage from February 1906 caught my attention. E. insists we accept his associate's offer of the girl. I remain unconvinced of the propriety, but he assures me her references are impeccable despite the unusual circumstances. She arrives tomorrow. I pray my reservations prove unfounded. 2 weeks later, another entry. The girl is peculiar but efficient, speaks rarely. The children are unsettled by her presence, particularly Victoria, who claims the girl stands at the foot of her bed at night. I've dismissed such nonsense, though I admit the girl's gaze is disconcerting. E seems satisfied with the arrangement. My pulse quickened. This had to be our mystery maid. The final entry concerning her appeared in late April. The incident with the girl has been resolved. E assures me all evidence of the arrangement has been handled with utmost discretion. We shall not speak of it again. I've instructed the staff similarly. What incident? What arrangement? And why would all evidence need to be erased? As I prepared to leave, Mrs. Winters approached with a troubled expression. Dr. Reeves, I recalled something that might interest you. Years ago, an elderly woman who claimed to have been a kitchen maid in a neighboring house told one of our docents a strange story about the Harringtons. She said they briefly employed a girl who wasn't like the others, a girl who didn't belong in this world. Now, the staff believed she brought misfortune to the house. Did she elaborate? I asked, feeling goosebumps rise on my arms. Only that the girl disappeared suddenly, and afterward the family forbade anyone from mentioning her. The woman seemed genuinely afraid, even decades later. Mrs. Winters hesitated. I dismissed it as superstition at the time. As I left the museum, the photograph seemed to weigh heavily in my bag. The maid had vanished from history. No employment record, no census entry, nothing but a few cryptic journal entries and a ghostly image staring through time. What had happened to her in that house? And why did I have the unshakable feeling she wanted me, specifically, to uncover the truth? Back at my office, I found Marcus engrossed in old newspapers from 1906. "Any luck at the Harrington place?" he asked without looking up. "Some cryptic journal entries," I replied, sharing Elizabeth Harrington's writings. Mentions of an incident and an arrangement that needed to be erased from record. Marcus finally looked up, his expression serious. "That fits with what I found. Check this out." He pushed forward a newspaper from May 1906, folded to a small article. "Domestic worker missing. Authorities puzzled." The brief report detailed the disappearance of an unidentified young woman who worked in a prominent Beacon Hill household. No name was provided, but the timing aligned perfectly with the journal entries. "There's more," Marcus continued, sliding over another clipping from 3 days later. This one merely noted that the investigation had been closed at the request of the employing family, who clarified that the young woman had returned to her homeland unexpectedly. "Aye, convenient explanation," I muttered. Did they specify which homeland? Marcus shook his head. That's just it. No details provided. And I found something else odd. Look at the photographer's mark on the original photo. I examined the cabinet card again. The photographer's imprint read, Sullivan and Sons, Boston. I researched them, Marcus said. They were the premier photography studio for Boston's elite. I contacted their archives and requested any information on this specific Harrington family portrait. And, according to their records, they photographed the Harringtons twice in 1906, once in January and once in June. But they have no record of this particular portrait. They're certain they didn't take it. I felt a chill. So, who did? Exactly. And here's where it gets weirder. He pulled out a magnifying glass and pointed to the maid's hand in the photograph. Look closely. Under magnification, I could see that while the maid's left hand hung naturally at her side, her right hand was positioned strangely, with 3 fingers slightly extended against her skirt, in an unnatural pose. The more I studied it, the more deliberate it appeared. It's almost like, I began. A signal, Marcus finished. I showed this to my sister, who knows sign language. It's not exact, but she said it resembles the sign for help. The revelation sent a wave of unease through me. If the maid was signaling for help in this photograph, what happened to her afterward? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes staring at me from across time. Around 2 a.m., I got up and examined the photograph again under my desk lamp. Something about the background caught my attention, a partially visible painting on the wall behind the family. I hadn't paid it much attention before, but now I realized it showed what appeared to be a basement or cellar scene. On a hunch, I accessed the digital blueprint archives of historical Boston homes. The Harrington estate had undergone several renovations over the decades, but the original plans showed something unusual, an extensive sub-basement level that didn't appear in later blueprints. According to the records, this level was sealed off during renovations in 1907, supposedly due to structural concerns. Just 1 year after the mysterious maid disappeared, I reached for my phone to call Marcus, but paused when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the photograph, previously examined dozens of times, the maid's face suddenly looked different. Her eyes, which had been staring directly at the camera, now appeared to be looking slightly to the side, directly at me. I dropped the photograph, my heart pounding. It was impossible, of course. A trick of the light, my exhausted mind playing tricks. But as I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought persisted. What if the reason no records existed of this girl wasn't because the Harringtons had destroyed them, but because she had never been officially documented in the first place? What if she came from somewhere or sometime where normal records didn't apply? And most disturbing of all, what if she was still somehow trapped there, using this photograph as her only means to reach out across the years? The next morning, I called Mrs. Winters at the Harrington Museum. I need access to the sealed sub-basement level, I said without preamble. A lengthy silence followed. Dr. Reeves, I'm not sure what you're referring to. The house has a standard cellar where we store archives, but there's no sub-basement. The original blueprints from 1883 show an additional level below the main cellar. According to renovation records, it was sealed off in 1907. Another pause. I've worked here for 23 years and never heard of such a space. Can you at least let me examine the cellar? There might be evidence of the sealed entrance. She reluctantly agreed. 3 hours later, I was back at the estate, following Mrs. Winters down narrow servants' stairs to the cellar level. The space had been modernized with proper lighting and climate control for archival storage. As you can see, just a standard basement, she said, gesturing around the organized shelves and cabinets. I walked the perimeter slowly, tapping on walls, looking for inconsistencies in the brickwork. Near the northeast corner, I noticed something. The walls sounded different, hollow somehow, and the bricks appeared newer than the surrounding masonry. This section has been sealed off, I said, running my hand along the bricks. The mortar work is different. Mrs. Winters frowned. That's impossible. Any significant structural work would be documented in our historical records. Not if someone wanted to keep it secret, I countered. As we debated, my phone rang. "Marcus, you need to come back immediately," he said, his voice tense. "I found something about the Harringtons you won't believe." I thanked Mrs. Winters and promised to return, ignoring her troubled expression as I left. Back at my office, Marcus had laid out several documents across my desk. "Edward Harrington wasn't just a banker," he began. "He was deeply involved in something called the Beacon Hill Circle, a secret society of wealthy Bostonians interested in the occult." He showed me a privately published book from 1901 entitled Thresholds, Passages Between Worlds, authored by a Professor Thaddeus Grant. The book was dedicated to my patrons and fellow seekers, with Edward Harrington prominently listed. The book theorizes that certain individuals can serve as vessels or bridges between different planes of existence, Marcus explained. It specifically mentions using photography to capture evidence of these threshold beings. My mind raced back to the photograph, to those eyes that seemed to shift their gaze. "You think the Maid was one of these beings?" "I don't know what to think," Marcus admitted. "But listen to this passage. The vessel, once brought into our plane, must be confined within specifically prepared boundaries. Should the vessel establish direct connection with an observer from our world, a bond may form, allowing the vessel to reach across time to communicate." I thought of how drawn I'd felt to the photograph from the moment I first saw it. How those eyes seemed to be looking directly at me, seeking connection. "There's more," Marcus continued grimly. "The book warns that such beings eventually become unstable in our world. The text recommends a ritual to return the vessel to its origin if this occurs." "The incident Elizabeth mentioned in her journal," I whispered, "and the arrangement that needed to be kept secret." Marcus nodded. "What if they didn't send her home or make her disappear in the conventional sense? What if they performed some kind of ritual?" The implications were disturbing, even if we were entertaining ideas that defied rational explanation. I pulled out the photograph again, studying the maid's face. This time I was certain. Her eyes had shifted slightly, and her expression seemed more urgent than before. "We need to get into that sealed basement," I said finally. "How?" "Mrs. Winters won't allow demolition of a historical wall based on our crazy theory." I stared at the photograph, at those pleading eyes. "Maybe we don't need to break down the wall. Maybe there's another way in." That's when I noticed something I'd overlooked before, a small object partially visible on a side table in the photograph. Under magnification, it appeared to be a distinctive key, with an unusual trefoil design at the head. The Harrington family crest, I realized. "We need to find this key." Marcus looked skeptical. "Even if it still exists, how would we find it after all these years?" I remembered something Mrs. Winters had mentioned during my first visit. The museum had recently acquired Elizabeth Harrington's personal effects from a distant relative, items that had been stored in a bank vault since her death in 1928. "I think I know where to look," I said, already reaching for my phone. What I couldn't have anticipated was that in seeking to uncover the truth about the nameless Maid, I was walking directly into the trap she had been setting for over a century. A trap designed to find someone who could finally set her free, no matter the cost. Mrs. Winters was surprisingly accommodating about letting me examine Elizabeth Harrington's personal effects. Perhaps my academic reputation lent credibility, or maybe she was simply curious about the mysteries I'd uncovered. "These items haven't been fully catalogued yet," she explained, leading me to a conservation room, where several acid-free boxes sat on a large table. "Take your time, but please wear these." She handed me a pair of white cotton gloves. I spent hours meticulously examining Elizabeth's belongings, embroidered handkerchiefs, personal correspondence, jewelry boxes, and various keepsakes. No key matching the one in the photograph. As afternoon faded into evening, I reached the final box. Inside was a small leather-bound prayer book with a tarnished silver clasp. When I opened it, a folded piece of paper fell out. I carefully unfolded it to find a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be the Harrington Estate's basement level, with a section marked in red ink. Scrawled in the margin were the words, "May God forgive what we have done. The threshold must remain sealed." My hands trembled as I turned the prayer book over, feeling its unusual weight. The back cover seemed thicker than it should be. Careful examination revealed a hidden compartment, and inside, the key with the trefoil design. I quickly photographed everything and replaced it exactly as I'd found it, thanking Mrs. Winters before leaving. Outside, night had fallen, and a light rain cast halos around the street lamps. I called Marcus immediately. "I found it," I said, "and a map showing what I believe is the entrance to the sealed room." "That's incredible," he replied, his tone uncertain. "What now?" "We go back tonight. The museum closes at 9. Meet me at the service entrance at 9:30. "Eleanor, this is breaking and entering. We could lose our careers, face criminal charges." "I know," I cut him off. "But something happened in that house, Marcus. Something they tried to erase from history. If you don't want to come, I understand." A long pause followed. "I'll be there," he finally said, "but I still think we're crossing a line." "Sometimes the truth requires crossing lines," I replied, thinking of those eyes in the photograph, now unmistakably pleading for help. At 9:35 p.m. we met at the service entrance. I'd borrowed Mrs. Winters' access card during my visit. Another line crossed. The building was dark and silent as we made our way down to the cellar. Using the hand-drawn map, we located the sealed wall I'd found earlier. The key fit into what appeared to be a decorative brick rosette that I'd previously mistaken for an architectural flourish. With a grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage with stone steps descending into darkness. "This is insane," Marcus whispered, the beam of his flashlight illuminating dust particles swirling in the air. "That wall looked solid. How is this possible?" "Hidden doors aren't uncommon in houses from this era," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Wealthy families often built secret rooms for valuables, or secrets." We descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a large chamber that smelled of mineral dampness and something else. An acrid, unpleasant odor I couldn't identify. Our flashlights revealed a disturbing scene. The room had been arranged as a kind of ritual space. Faded markings formed a large circle on the stone floor with strange symbols at cardinal points. A wooden table stood at the center, its surface stained dark. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with ancient-looking tomes. Opposite stood a large antique camera on a tripod, its brass lens gleaming dully in our flashlight beams. "My God," Marcus breathed. "They actually did it. The Beacon Hill Circle. They performed some kind of ritual down here." I approached the camera, noting its unusual design. It resembled photography equipment from the early 1900s, but with modifications. Additional lenses, strange attachments, and what looked like mirrors arranged to create multiple light paths. "This must be how they took the photograph," I said, "the one with the maid." As I examined the camera, Marcus investigated the bookshelves. "Eleanor, look at this." He held up a leather journal. "It's dated 1906, signed by Edward Harrington." We opened it carefully, reading by flashlight. The journal detailed the Beacon Hill Circle's experiments with what they called threshold photography, attempts to capture images of beings from the other side. Most attempts had failed until they discovered a method involving a specialized camera and a particular type of silver bromide emulsion. The most disturbing entries concerned their success in actually bringing one such being into our world. A young female entity they dressed as a maid to hide in plain sight among their household staff. "We have accomplished what no others before us have managed," Edward wrote. "The being appears human in all respects, though it neither eats nor sleeps as we do. It speaks rarely and when it does, its voice carries echoes of elsewhere. Most remarkable is its effect on photographic plates. It appears slightly displaced, as if not fully materialized in our plane of existence. Later entries grew increasingly concerned. The being is changing. Its gaze now follows us continuously, and the servants report finding it in rooms where it should not be. Victoria claims it stands over her bed at night. Most concerning, it has begun to form a connection with individuals who observe its photograph, reaching across time in ways we did not anticipate. We must return it before the boundaries between worlds weaken further. The final entry, dated May 3rd, 1906, was chilling. The ritual of return was completed at midnight. The being resisted violently, more so than anticipated. Johnson and Phillips were severely injured in the struggle. The threshold is sealed, but I fear something has gone wrong. The photographic plates show anomalies. The being's essence should have been fully extracted, yet traces remain captured in the images. I have ordered all photographs destroyed, save one which I have secured. May God forgive what necessity has compelled us to do. As I finished reading, the temperature in the room seemed to drop sharply. Our flashlight beams dimmed, and I felt a pressure in my ears, as if the air itself was being compressed. "Marcus," I whispered, "we need to leave. Now." But as we turned toward the stairs, our flashlights revealed a figure standing at the bottom of the steps. A young woman in a maid's uniform, her face identical to the one in the photograph. Her mouth didn't move, but I heard her voice clearly in my mind. "You found me. After all this time, someone finally came." The apparition of the maid stood motionless, her form seeming to flicker slightly at the edges, like an old film projection. Her eyes, those same penetrating eyes from the photograph, fixed on mine. "Marcus," I whispered, "do you see her?" He nodded slowly, his face pale in the dim flashlight beam. What is she?" The voice in my mind came again, though the maid's lips remained still. "I am not what they believed, not a threshold being. I was Anna Korlovich, a girl of 17 from a village near Minsk. I came to America in 1905, seeking work." "How is this possible?" I asked aloud, my voice echoing in the stone chamber. "The circle sought something from beyond," the presence continued. "Their ritual opened a door, but not to another world, to something between. When they realized their mistake, they tried to close it, using me as a sacrifice. A wave of cold washed over me. They killed you. My body, yes. But they did not understand the camera they had created. It captured more than my image. It captured part of my essence, my consciousness. I became trapped, able to observe but not interact, except through the photograph." Marcus had been slowly backing toward the stairs. "Eleanor, we need to go. This isn't right." The maid's form suddenly shifted, appearing directly in front of him. "No one leaves, not until I am free." "What do you want from us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her attention returned to me. "For decades I tried to connect with someone through my photograph. Many looked, but none saw. Not truly. Until you, Eleanor. You felt it from the first moment, didn't you? The connection." She was right. From the instant I'd seen the photograph, I'd felt drawn to it in a way I couldn't explain. "The ritual that bound me can be reversed," she continued. "That is why I led you here, to this place, to the camera and the books. You will complete the circle and set me free." "And if we refuse?" Marcus asked. The temperature dropped further, frost beginning to form on the stone walls. "Then you will take my place, and I will take yours. The threshold demands balance." I felt a surge of terror at her words, but also an unexpected pang of sympathy. Whatever she was now, she had once been a young immigrant girl, betrayed and murdered by powerful men who thought their wealth gave them the right to experiment with forces they didn't understand. "Show us what to do," I said, ignoring Marcus's look of alarm. The maid, Anna, directed us to prepare the ritual space according to diagrams in one of the books. We repositioned the antique camera, lighting candles at specific points around the circle on the floor. The final step involved developing a new photographic plate using chemicals we found stored in a cabinet. As we worked, I whispered to Marcus, "We're not actually going through with this. We need to play along until we find a way out." "There is no way out," Anna's voice echoed in our minds. "The connection is already formed. The threshold is opening." The air in the chamber began to warp and shimmer, like heat rising from pavement on a summer day. The candle flames stretched and distorted, casting bizarre, elongated shadows on the walls. "Now," Anna instructed, "take my photograph with the camera. Capture me as I truly am, not as they forced me to appear." Marcus shot me a desperate look. "Eleanor, think about what you're doing." But I was already moving toward the camera, feeling as though my actions were only partially my own. I positioned myself behind the antique device, looking through its viewfinder at Anna, who now stood in the center of the circle. Through the lens, her appearance shifted, her maid's uniform dissolving into the simple dress of a peasant girl, her face younger, frightened yet determined. "Now," she whispered, both in my mind and aloud this time, her lips finally moving. I pressed the camera's shutter release. A blinding flash erupted, far brighter than should have been possible from the small amount of flash powder in the tray. The concussive force knocked me backward, and I heard Marcus cry out in alarm. When my vision cleared, the room had changed. The ritual circle glowed with an unnatural light, and the space within it seemed to recede infinitely, as if we were looking down a tunnel that stretched into impossible distance. In the center stood Anna, her form now solid and clear. She looked at her hands in wonder, then at us, a smile spreading across her face. "It's working," she said, her voice now audible in the room. "I can feel myself becoming whole again." But something was wrong. As Anna solidified, I felt myself growing lighter, less substantial. Looking down at my hands, I could see the stone floor through them. "Marcus," I gasped, "run!" He lunged for the stairs, but invisible forces held him back. Anna watched us with a mixture of regret and determination. "I'm sorry," she said, "but the threshold must be balanced. A soul for a soul. You opened the door, Eleanor. Your connection to me was strongest. You will take my place." I felt myself being pulled toward the center of the circle, toward that impossible tunnel of light. My body was becoming transparent, while Anna grew more solid with each passing second. In desperation, I grabbed Edward Harrington's journal and hurled it into the circle. The effect was immediate. The light wavered, the pulling sensation momentarily weakened. "The journal," I realized aloud, "it contains part of the original ritual, part of the binding. It's connected to this place, to what happened here." Understanding dawned, and I turned to Marcus. "The photograph, the original photograph, it's in my bag." He scrambled for my satchel, retrieving the cabinet card with Anna's image. As the pulling force intensified again, I shouted, "Destroy it! Burn it!" Marcus didn't hesitate. He thrust the photograph into the nearest candle flame. The old paper caught immediately, curling and blackening. Anna screamed, a sound of rage and despair that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her now solid form began to fracture, cracks of light appearing across her skin. "What have you done?" she cried. "I was so close." "I'm sorry," I said, feeling genuine remorse despite everything. "You deserved justice, not an eternity trapped between worlds, but I can't take your place." The burning photograph released tendrils of oily black smoke that swirled unnaturally, forming patterns similar to the symbols on the floor. The tunnel of light in the circle began to collapse inward. "This won't end with me," Anna warned, her voice distorting as her form began to disintegrate. "The threshold remains. Others will find it. Others will come through." With a final, devastating shriek, she dissolved into particles of light that were sucked into the collapsing tunnel. The candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging the chamber into darkness, broken only by our flashlight beams. In the sudden silence, Marcus and I stood trembling, barely able to comprehend what we'd witnessed. "We need to seal this place," I finally said. "Permanently. No one can ever find it again." As we gathered the books and camera to remove them from the chamber, I noticed something on the stone floor where Anna had stood, a small, tarnished locket. Inside was a faded photograph of a young peasant girl standing beside an older woman, likely her mother. On the back, written in Cyrillic script, was the name Anna Korlovich, and a date, 1903. She had been real after all. Not a being from another dimension, but a girl with a life, a family, and dreams of a better future in America, all cut short by wealthy men playing with forces they didn't understand. We left the chamber, using mortar from the museum's maintenance supplies to seal the entrance more thoroughly than before. The key I placed in an envelope addressed to a secure vault at my university, with instructions that it not be opened for 50 years. In my final report on domestic workers in the Gilded Age, I included a brief mention of Anna Korlovich, an immigrant maid who had worked for the Harrington family briefly in 1906, before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. It was little enough, but at least her name would not be entirely forgotten by history. The investigation changed me. I find myself looking more closely at old photographs now, paying attention to the faces at the edges, the servants, the workers, the unnamed individuals whose stories history has overlooked. Sometimes I swear I can feel them looking back, their eyes meeting mine across the decades, silently asking to be remembered. And sometimes in my dreams I see Anna as she was meant to be, not a vengeful spirit or a threshold being, but simply a young woman standing in the sunlight, finally free. 6 months passed. My book on domestic workers was published to modest academic acclaim, and I returned to my regular teaching duties at the university. I mentioned the Harrington incident to no one except Marcus, who had grown distant since our experience in the sub-basement. We'd agreed that the full truth was too outlandish to share. Who would believe us? On a rainy Tuesday in November, I arrived at my office to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 1894, 12 years before the Harrington incident. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance of Local Photographer's Assistant." The article detailed how a young man named James Sullivan, who worked for his father's photography studio, Sullivan & Sons, had vanished without explanation. According to witnesses, he had been experimenting with innovative photographic techniques in the weeks before his disappearance. Sullivan & Sons, the same studio whose mark appeared on the Harrington photograph, though they had no record of taking it. A note accompanied the clipping, handwritten in shaky script. "You're not the first to discover the threshold. You won't be the last. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed." I immediately called Marcus, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Concerned, I drove to his apartment. His landlady hadn't seen him in 3 days. His door was unlocked, the interior immaculate except for his desk, which was covered with books on early photographic techniques and printouts of articles about Sullivan & Sons. On his computer, I found dozens of digital manipulations of the Harrington photograph, versions where he'd enhanced different elements, altered contrast, examined shadows. In the most recent version, dated just 2 days earlier, he'd somehow managed to reveal what appeared to be a shadowy figure standing behind the maid, a young man whose features, though blurry, resembled old photos of James Sullivan I found in his research. I called the police, reporting Marcus missing, but I knew they wouldn't find him. The threshold had claimed another victim. That night, unable to sleep, I reviewed my notes on the Harrington case. Something had been bothering me about Anna's story. Inconsistencies I'd overlooked in the moment. If she had truly been an immigrant girl sacrificed by the Beacon Hill Circle, why had no one reported her missing? Immigrant communities in Boston were close-knit. The disappearance of a young woman would have caused concern, generated at least local news coverage. And if Edward Harrington's journal was accurate, the circle had been attempting to contact beings from beyond, not sacrificing innocent girls. They seemed genuinely surprised and frightened by what they had brought through. A terrible suspicion began to form. What if Anna Korlovich had never been an innocent victim? What if the entity in the photograph had merely adopted her identity, used her story to earn my sympathy? I returned to the university archives, searching for any record of an Anna Korlovich arriving at Ellis Island in 1905. After hours of searching immigration records, I found her. Anna Korlovich, age 17, from Minsk, arrived June 12, 1905, aboard the SS Baltic. But the real shock came when I cross-referenced employment records. Anna had indeed worked as a domestic servant. Not for the Harringtons, but for the Sullivan family, the same Sullivans who owned the photography studio. She had been hired shortly after James Sullivan's disappearance. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more disturbing than I'd imagined. James Sullivan hadn't simply disappeared. He had been the first to open the threshold, perhaps accidentally through his photographic experiments. Whatever came through had taken him, then moved on to the Harrington household using Anna's identity after she too had fallen victim. My phone rang, startling me from my research. Unknown number. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Dr. Reeves." The voice was Marcus's, but wrong somehow, flatter, with that same echo-like quality I'd heard in the basement. "I've found something remarkable. You need to see it." My blood ran cold. "Where are you, Marcus?" "I went back to the Harrington estate. Found another way in, the threshold. It's still open, Eleanor, and it's not what we thought. Not a doorway to another dimension, but to another time. We can use it, Eleanor. Imagine the historical research possibilities." "Marcus, listen to me. That's not what the threshold is. It's using you, like it used Anna and James Sullivan before her. You need to see for yourself," he insisted. "I've set up the camera again, just one session, for research." "I'm calling the police," I said. "They won't find me," he replied calmly. "No one will unless you come alone. Tonight, midnight." The line went dead. I sat frozen, weighing my options. Calling the authorities would be useless. How could I explain any of this? But going alone to meet whatever was wearing Marcus like a suit was equally dangerous. I needed leverage, something to use against the entity. Returning to my notes, I focused on what had weakened it before. Burning the photograph had disrupted its connection. The ritual circle, the camera, the threshold itself, all seemed to operate on principles of sympathetic magic. Images and objects connected to their subjects. I drove to Marcus's apartment again, searching for personal items. A photograph of him as a child, a family heirloom, anything with strong emotional connections. In his bedroom, I found what I needed, a well-worn baseball mitt with Marcus written on the leather in faded marker, obviously a treasured childhood possession. Armed with this and a can of accelerant from a hardware store, I arrived at the Harrington estate just before midnight. The service entrance was unlocked. Following the now familiar path to the basement, I discovered our careful mortar seal had been broken open, the hidden door standing ajar. Steeling myself, I descended the stone steps into the chamber. What I saw stopped me cold. The ritual circle had been redrawn, more elaborate than before. The antique camera stood ready on its tripod, but it had been modified further with modern components, digital attachments jury-rigged to the antique frame, cables running to Marcus's laptop. Marcus himself stood by the camera, but the man I knew was barely visible beneath the thing wearing him. His movements were too fluid, his posture too perfect. When he turned to me, his eyes had that same penetrating quality I'd seen in the photograph of Anna. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive echo. "You came, I knew you would." "Where's Marcus?" I demanded, clutching the baseball mitt inside my bag. "Here, part of him at least." The thing wearing Marcus gestured to the camera. "I've improved the process. The original circle was primitive in their understanding. The threshold isn't to another world or dimension, it's to the space between moments, the fold in time where consciousness can exist independently of physical form. "What are you?" I asked, edging closer to the circle. "I am becoming," it replied cryptically. "As you will be. The camera doesn't just capture images, Eleanor. It captures potential. What could be, what might have been. I existed in potential until the Sullivan boy gave me form through his experiments. Then Anna, then the Harrington girl, now Marcus. Each vessel allows me to become more real. And what happens to the vessels? To Marcus?" A smile that wasn't Marcus's spread across his face. "They contribute to my becoming. Their memories, experiences, emotions, all valuable, all preserved after a fashion. You're consuming them," I translated, "wearing them down until nothing's left but a shell you can inhabit." A crude interpretation, but essentially correct. It gestured to the camera. "Now it's your turn, Eleanor. Your connection to history, your empathy for forgotten lives. You're perfect. Better than Marcus. Take his place in the circle." "And if I refuse?" Its expression hardened. "Then Marcus suffers the consequences of your selfishness. He's still aware, Eleanor, still experiencing everything. His consciousness is stretched thin, but present." I reached into my bag, fingers closing around the baseball mitt. Let me speak to him, the real Marcus. For a moment the entity seemed to recede. Marcus's posture changed, becoming more hunched, more human. His eyes cleared, filled with panic. "Eleanor," he gasped, his voice his own again. "It's in my head, using my memories, my knowledge. Don't listen to anything it—" He convulsed suddenly, the entity reasserting control. "Enough. Choose now, Eleanor. Join us willingly, or watch what happens when I take a vessel by force." I withdrew the baseball mitt from my bag. "You mentioned memories and emotional connections. That's the key, isn't it? That's how you maintain your hold, through objects and images with emotional significance." The thing wearing Marcus went very still, its eyes fixed on the mitt. "What are you doing?" I pulled out the small can of accelerant. "Testing a theory." I doused the mitt and withdrew a lighter. "Stop!" it commanded, taking a step forward. "Release Marcus," I demanded, "or I destroy this connection to his past, his identity." "You don't understand what you're doing," it hissed. "Sever too many connections, and there won't be enough left of him to save." "I'm counting on that working both ways," I replied, flicking the lighter. "Your hold depends on emotional connections, memories, identity. Burn enough of those, and your anchor in our world weakens." Before it could lunge forward, I set the mitt ablaze and tossed it into the center of the ritual circle. The effect was immediate and violent. Marcus's body contorted in agony as a high-pitched wail filled the chamber. The flaming mitt didn't just burn. It seemed to release waves of energy that disrupted the carefully drawn symbols of the circle. Taking advantage of the momentary chaos, I rushed to the antique camera and toppled it from its tripod, sending it crashing to the stone floor. The brass housing split open, releasing a cloud of silvery dust that seemed to move with purpose, swirling like a miniature tornado. "No!" the entity shrieked through Marcus's mouth. "What have you done?" The silver particles from the camera began to attach themselves to Marcus's skin, covering him in a metallic second skin. He thrashed wildly, trying to brush them away, but they clung tighter, seeming to sink beneath the surface. I grabbed Marcus's laptop, discovering dozens of digital images, photographs he'd taken of himself using the antique camera, each showing subtle distortions, evidence of the entity's growing control. I systematically deleted them, erasing each connection the entity had established. As the last file disappeared, Marcus collapsed to the floor, the silver particles separated from his body, reforming into a vaguely humanoid shape that flickered and wavered, as if struggling to maintain cohesion. I recognized elements of Anna in its shifting features, and glimpses of what must have been James Sullivan, along with others. All its previous vessels contributing to its unstable form. "You cannot destroy me," it said, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "I exist in potential, always have, always will." "Maybe," I acknowledged, "but not here, not now, not using my friend as your vessel." I turned to the final step in my desperate plan, Marcus's laptop itself. Whatever connection the entity had established through the digital files, the computer had become part of its network, another anchor in our world. I doused the laptop with the remaining accelerant and set it ablaze. As it burned, the silvery figure began to disintegrate, pulled towards some invisible point at the center of the ritual circle. "We will meet again, Eleanor Reeves," it promised as it collapsed inward. "In another time, another place. The threshold remains." With a sound like air rushing to fill a vacuum, the entity vanished. The flaming laptop and mitt burned themselves out, leaving the circle scorched but intact. Marcus lay unconscious but breathing. As I helped him from the chamber, I used the remaining accelerant to set fire to the books, papers, and remaining photographic equipment. The old wood furnishings caught quickly, and we barely made it up the stairs before the sub-basement was engulfed in flames. I triggered the museum's fire alarm as we escaped, ensuring the fire would be contained before it could spread to the historic structure above. By morning, firefighters would discover a previously unknown sub-basement, severely damaged by fire. A historical curiosity, nothing more. Marcus recovered slowly over the following weeks, with no clear memory of his time under the entity's influence. Brain scans showed unusual activity patterns that gradually normalized, and occasionally he reported dreams of being stretched across multiple places at once. And I never told him my suspicions, that perhaps the entity hadn't been fully banished, that parts of it might remain dormant within him, waiting. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. 3 months after the fire at the Harrington estate, I received an invitation to examine a private collection of Civil War-era photographs recently discovered in a bank vault in Richmond, Virginia. The collection supposedly included rare images of hospital scenes taken with experimental techniques. I almost declined. After the Harrington incident, I developed an aversion to historical photography, particularly anything described as experimental. But professional curiosity won out, and I found myself in a climate-controlled examination room at the Virginia Historical Society, wearing white cotton gloves as I carefully sorted through the fragile images. Most were standard carte de visite and stereographs typical of the era, battlefield scenes, portraits of soldiers, the usual documentation of America's bloodiest conflict. But near the bottom of the collection, I found something that made my blood freeze, a photograph of a field hospital, dated 1863. In the background, partially obscured by a tent flap, stood a young woman in period dress. While the doctors and patients in the foreground gazed elsewhere, this figure stared directly at the camera with unmistakable intensity. The same penetrating gaze I'd seen in Anna's photograph. Turning it over with trembling hands, I found an inscription. "Nurse assisting Dr. Sullivan, Antietam Field Hospital, September 1863. Sullivan." The same name as the photography studio in Boston, some 40 years later. With growing unease, I searched through the remaining photographs. 3 more contained the same woman, always at the edges, always staring directly into the camera. In the final image, she stood beside a young doctor, presumably Dr. Sullivan, who had the same features I'd glimpsed in the shadowy figure behind Anna in Marcus's enhanced version of the Harrington photograph. The threshold hadn't begun with James Sullivan in the 1890s. It stretched back further, perhaps much further than I'd imagined. I declined to continue the consultation, recommending another expert complete the cataloguing. On my flight home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been meant to find those photographs, that they'd been placed there specifically for me to discover. My suspicions were confirmed when I arrived home to find my apartment door unlocked. Nothing was missing, but on my desk sat a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was an antique photographic plate made of glass, its surface cloudy with age. When held up to the light, it revealed a classroom scene from the early 1900s, rows of students facing a teacher at the blackboard. In the back row sat a girl of about 10, her face turned directly to the camera while everyone else faced forward. Though the image was faded, her eyes seemed to gleam with unnatural clarity. A note accompanied the plate. Boston Public School, Na 17, 1908. She found another vessel after the Harrington incident. She's been watching your family for generations. You were chosen long before you found her photograph. With shaking hands, I retrieved a box of old family photographs from my closet. In an album my grandmother had compiled, I found a class picture from Boston Public School, at 17, dated 1908. My great-grandmother, Eleanor Winters, for whom I'd been named, stood at the blackboard, the teacher in the photographic plate. I had been led to the Harrington photograph not by academic interest or coincidence, but by an entity that had been observing my family for over a century, patiently waiting for the right vessel to emerge. That night, I gathered every photograph of myself, physical and digital, and destroyed them systematically. I deleted social media accounts, removed online profiles, erased as much of my visual presence from the world as possible. I knew it was likely futile. The entity existed in potential, as it had said, in the spaces between moments, in the possibilities captured by the camera's eye. It was patient. It could wait. 2 weeks later, Marcus called. His voice sounded strange, distant. "I found something you should see," he said. "An old photograph. I think it's your great-grandmother." My heart sank. "Where did you find it?" "It was slipped under my door. Eleanor, her eyes, they're looking right at me." The connection had already begun again. The threshold remained open, and the entity was still seeking its perfect vessel. "Don't look at it anymore," I urged. "Burn it. Now." "Too late," he replied, his voice taking on that familiar echo. "I've been looking at it for hours." It's remarkable, really. The clarity, the focus, almost like it was taken yesterday. I hung up and immediately called the police, reporting a potential suicide risk at Marcus's address. It wasn't true, but it would get them there quickly. Then I grabbed my coat and car keys, unsure what I would do when I arrived, but knowing I couldn't abandon him again. As I reached for the door, my phone chimed with an incoming text. From Marcus's number, a single image, a photograph of my bedroom, taken from the perspective of someone standing in the doorway. In the mirror on my dresser, visible as a reflection, stood a figure that was both Marcus and not Marcus, its eyes gleaming with that same penetrating intensity. The message beneath the image read, "Thresholds work both ways, Eleanor. I'm already here." I turned slowly to face my bedroom door, which I was certain I had left closed. It now stood open, revealing a darkness deeper than night. From within that darkness, I heard the mechanical click of a camera shutter. In that moment, I understood a fundamental truth about photographs. They don't just capture light bouncing off subjects, they capture moments in time, preserving them eternally. And some things, once preserved, can never truly be destroyed. They only wait, patient and watchful, for someone to look deeply enough into the image to establish a connection, a threshold, a way in. As I stood frozen, unable to flee, unable to scream, I heard one final message in that echoing voice that was and wasn't Marcus. "Smile, Eleanor. This is history in the making." I don't remember losing consciousness, but I must have, because I awoke to the sound of insistent knocking on my apartment door. Disoriented, I found myself lying on my living room floor. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Morning had come. The knocking continued. Cautiously, I approached the door, checking through the peephole to see 2 police officers standing in the hallway. "Dr. Reeves, Boston PD, we need to speak with you about Marcus Chen." I opened the door, trying to appear normal despite my rumpled clothes and the lingering terror of the previous night. "What about Marcus?" I asked, my mouth dry. "When was the last time you saw him, Mum?" "A few days ago. We worked together at the university. Why? What's happened?" The officers exchanged glances. "Mr. Chen's apartment was found empty this morning, with concerning evidence that prompted his landlady to call us. There are photographs and writing covering the walls, many featuring you. They showed me images on a department tablet, Marcus's apartment transformed into a shrine of obsession. Historical photographs I'd never seen before, pinned alongside surveillance-style photos of me going about my daily routine. Writings covered every available surface, a mixture of academic research on photographic techniques and disturbing ramblings about the threshold and vessels waiting to be filled. We have reason to believe Mr. Chen may be experiencing a psychotic episode," the officer continued. "Some of his writings suggest he may attempt to harm you. Have you received any concerning communications from him?" I thought of the text message, the photograph of my bedroom, but something stopped me from mentioning it. Instead, I showed them our normal academic exchanges from days earlier. After they left with warnings to call immediately if Marcus contacted me, I checked my phone. The threatening text and photograph from the previous night were gone. No record in my message history. Had I imagined it all? Was I experiencing the same psychosis they suspected in Marcus? I called the university's history department, where a confused secretary informed me that Marcus had submitted his resignation via email 2 weeks ago, citing personal reasons. According to her, he'd cleaned out his office over the weekend. I'd seen Marcus at work just days ago, or thought I had. Increasingly desperate for answers, I drove to the Boston Public Library to use their historical newspaper archives, searching for any pattern, any precedent that might explain what was happening. Hours later, I had assembled a disturbing timeline. Every 40 years, almost to the day, reports emerged of individuals in the photography profession experiencing sudden personality changes, followed by disappearances. James Sullivan in 1894. A darkroom technician named Patricia Howell in 1934, a photography professor, William Miller, in 1974. Each had become obsessed with experimental photographic techniques before vanishing. And in each case, someone close to them had reported seeing these individuals after their official disappearances, always with that same intense, penetrating gaze. The pattern was clear. The entity moved from vessel to vessel, using each to prepare for the next transition. Its ultimate goal remained unclear, but the 40-year cycle suggested it was building toward something. 2014 would have been the next occurrence in the pattern. What had happened then? A memory surfaced. A news story about a promising young photographer who had committed suicide after destroying all of his work. His name had been Sullivan, James Sullivan VI, descendant of the original photography family. The bloodline connection couldn't be coincidence. The entity had been working its way through the Sullivan family for generations, using others as temporary vessels between Sullivan hosts. If my theory was correct, Marcus wasn't the entity's true target. He was merely a stepping stone, a temporary vessel. But a vessel for what purpose? As if in answer to my unspoken question, my phone chimed with an email notification. From Marcus's account, a single image attachment with no subject line. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The photograph showed Marcus standing in front of the Boston Registry of Births, Deaths, and Marriages. His expression was wrong, that same unnatural intensity I'd come to recognize. But what truly chilled me was the realization that this photo couldn't have been taken by Marcus himself. Someone else had photographed him. The entity was working with an accomplice. The email's timestamp indicated it had been sent just 30 minutes ago. If I hurried, I might intercept him at the registry office. 20 minutes later, I stood in the lobby of the government building, scanning faces for any sign of Marcus. Instead, I spotted an elderly clerk waving to get my attention. "Dr. Reeves," he called, "your colleague said you'd be coming. He left an envelope for you." Inside was a printout of a birth certificate from 1983. my birth certificate. But the names were wrong. Where my parents' names should have been, the document listed Elizabeth Sullivan as my mother and Edward Harrington III as my father. A handwritten note accompanied the forgery. Your bloodlines converge, Sullivan and Harrington. The perfect vessel created through generations of careful selection. The threshold opens completely in 3 days. The camera is ready. You will join us willingly, or Marcus will suffer the consequences. Tucked behind the note was a small yellowed newspaper clipping from 1983, announcing the birth of Eleanor Reeves to Margaret and Thomas Reeves. The photograph showed my parents holding infant me in the hospital. Standing beside them, barely noticeable in the background, was a nurse whose face was slightly blurred, but whose eyes remained in perfect, penetrating focus. The entity had been present at my birth, had perhaps engineered it. As I stood frozen in shock, my phone rang, my mother's number. I answered with trembling hands. "Eleanor? Thank goodness. I've been trying to reach you." Her voice sounded strained. "There's a man here asking strange questions about our family history. Says he's your colleague. Mom, listen carefully. Don't let him in. Call the police immediately. Tell them—" "Oh, he's already inside, dear. Has been for hours. Such a nice young man, really. He's helping your father set up an old camera he brought. Says he wants to take a family portrait for your project on photographic history." In the background, I heard a mechanical click I recognized all too well. The distinctive sound of an antique camera's shutter. "Mom, get out of the house now. Don't look at the camera." But the line had already gone dead. I raced to my parents' home on the outskirts of Boston, breaking every traffic law along the way. The house stood quiet when I arrived, no signs of disturbance. My mother answered the door with a puzzled expression. "Eleanor, we weren't expecting you. Your colleague said you'd be joining us tomorrow for the photograph." She seemed perfectly normal, but something subtle was wrong. A slight flatness to her voice, a too perfect stillness to her posture. "Where's Dad?" I asked, stepping cautiously into the house. "In the study with your friend, setting up the equipment. They've been at it for hours." In the study, I found my father adjusting an antique camera on a tripod. The same camera I'd seen in the Harrington sub-basement, somehow restored after the fire. Marcus stood nearby, his movements too fluid, his smile too fixed. "Ah, Eleanor," the thing wearing Marcus said. "You're early. We're not quite ready for you yet." My father turned, and I saw that his eyes now had that same penetrating quality. "Daughter, how wonderful that you'll be joining us. The family will finally be complete." "What have you done to them?" I demanded. "Nothing permanent yet." The entity gestured to the camera. "They've merely been prepared. The initial exposure creates a connection. The final portrait tomorrow will complete the process." I noticed photographs spread across my father's desk, old family images spanning generations. In each one, barely noticeable in the background, that same figure appeared in different guises. The entity had been watching my family for over a century, manipulating bloodlines, guiding events toward this moment. "Why me?" I asked, buying time as I inched toward the camera. "Why my family?" "Bloodlines matter," it explained. "The Sullivans created the first threshold through their photographic experiments. The Harringtons strengthened it through their rituals. When those bloodlines converge, as they do in you, though you didn't know it, the vessel becomes capable of sustaining a complete transition." My mind raced. My parents were Thomas and Margaret Reeves, not Harringtons or Sullivans. Reading my confusion, the entity smiled with Marcus's face. "Your grandmother had an affair with a Harrington descendant. Your mother never knew her true father, and your father's mother was born a Sullivan, though the name was changed. You are the culmination of generations of careful curation." "For what purpose?" I asked, now standing beside the camera. "Permanence," it said simply. "Each vessel deteriorates eventually, each threshold closes, but you can sustain a permanent doorway. Through you, what exists in potential can fully enter this world. And then what? Then we remake reality according to our vision. Time becomes flexible. History becomes malleable. It gestured to my parents, who stood unnaturally still. They'll be the first to be remade. Then others. The world you know will be preserved only in photographs, static, unchanging moments, while we exist in the spaces between. As it spoke, I noticed something about the antique camera, a small glass plate already positioned inside, waiting for exposure. On it I could make out a faint image already present, a family portrait with spaces left conspicuously empty, waiting to be filled. With sudden clarity I understood. The entity couldn't simply take me as a vessel. It needed me to willingly step into the photograph, to accept my place in the composition. The threshold wasn't just a doorway between worlds. It was a doorway between reality and potential, between the world as it is and the world as it could be. In one swift motion, I grabbed the glass plate from the camera and smashed it against the edge of the desk. The entity shrieked in Marcus's voice, lunging toward me as the plate shattered. My parents collapsed simultaneously, like marionettes with cut strings. As the entity reached for me, I noticed its form flickering, struggling to maintain cohesion without the photographic plate as an anchor. "You cannot stop what's already in motion," it hissed. "The threshold has existed for centuries. It will find another way." "Maybe," I acknowledged, backing toward the door. "But not through me. Not through my family." I fled the house, helping my dazed parents to my car. They remembered nothing of Marcus's visit or the camera, their memories seemingly reset to earlier that morning. That night, as they slept safely in my apartment, I researched obsessively, searching for a way to permanently close the threshold. Every source led me back to the same conclusion. The entity existed in potential, in the captured moments of photography. As long as images existed, so did the possibility of its return. 3 days later, I stood outside a secure storage facility on the outskirts of Boston, Marcus beside me. The real Marcus, who had been found wandering confused in a bus station with no memory of the previous week. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, eyeing the metal container at our feet. I nodded grimly. Inside the container were the last remaining photographs of my family, every image I'd been able to gather from relatives, friends, and digital sources. Along with them was every piece of research I'd collected on the threshold, the entity, and the bloodlines it had manipulated for generations. "If it can't see us, it can't reach us," I explained. "No more photographs, no more records. We disappear from its sight." As we poured accelerant over the container and set it ablaze, I thought about the generations of Sullivans and Harringtons who had unknowingly contributed to creating the perfect vessel, me. I thought about the entity, patient and calculating, manipulating bloodlines across centuries. I thought about all the missing photographers and subjects who had fallen victim to its hunger for form, for permanence. The flames consumed our history, erasing the visual evidence of our existence. In the modern world, choosing to leave no photographic trace would be difficult, but not impossible. We would become ghosts in the system, visible but never captured, never preserved in that moment of potential the entity required. As the fire died down, Marcus asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Do you really think this will stop it?" I watched the last photographs curl and blacken in the flames. "No," I admitted. "But it buys us time, and it sends a message. We won't be its vessels." Not willingly. In the months that followed, I left my position at the university, abandoning my book on domestic workers of the Gilded Age. Marcus and I relocated frequently, using cash, avoiding cameras, living off the grid as much as possible in the modern world. Sometimes I see it watching from reflective surfaces, that same penetrating gaze in the eyes of strangers caught in my peripheral vision. Waiting, patient, the threshold remains. The camera shutter continues to click, capturing moments frozen in time, preserving possibilities. And in those possibilities, in the space between what is and what could be, something waits to emerge. If you're reading this account, recorded not in photographs but in words, take this as both warning and testament. Be careful what you preserve. Be mindful of what you capture. And if you find an old photograph where someone stares directly at the camera with unusual intensity, someone at the edges of the frame who doesn't quite belong, look away. Once you establish the connection, the threshold begins to open, and it's watching you now. In the 5 years since destroying the last photographs of my family, I've lived as a ghost, moving frequently, using cash, avoiding digital footprints. Marcus eventually returned to academia under a different name, unable to sustain the paranoia that had become my constant companion. We maintained contact through burner phones and coded messages, but I've kept my distance, fearing that my presence in his life might once again draw the entity's attention. I found work as a manuscript restorer at a private library in rural Vermont, where my expertise in historical documents proved valuable and few questions were asked about my past. I lived in a small cabin on the property, isolated and secure, until 3 weeks ago, when I received a package with no return address. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting was immediately familiar, Elizabeth Harrington's distinctive script. But this wasn't the journal I'd found at the museum. This was its predecessor, written years before the incident with the Maid. A note accompanied it. The cycle begins again, December 18th, 2025. The convergence approaches. You cannot hide from what exists between moments. December 18th, 2025, exactly 40 years after the last recorded incident in 1985. With trembling hands, I opened the journal. Most entries detailed mundane aspects of Elizabeth's life, but scattered throughout were references to the Camera Obscura Society, apparently the original name of the Beacon Hill Circle before Edward Harrington took control. The society had been founded not in Boston, but in London in the 1830s, coinciding with the earliest days of photography. Its members had discovered that certain combinations of chemicals and techniques created images that captured more than light. They captured potential. As I read further, a new understanding emerged. The entity, or entities, hadn't originated with James Sullivan or the Harringtons. They had always existed in the spaces between moments, in the potential unrealized. Photography had simply provided them a window into our world, and they had been reaching through that window for nearly 2 centuries. Most disturbing was Elizabeth's description of the convergence, a rare alignment of bloodlines and timing that would allow for a complete manifestation. The Camera Obscura Society had been deliberately arranging marriages and births for generations, creating vessels with increasing capacity to sustain the threshold. My phone rang. One of my burner phones that only Marcus had the number for. "Eleanor!" His voice was tight with fear. "They found me." "Who? The entity?" "No, the society. The Camera Obscura Society. They're still active, Eleanor. They've been watching us since the Harrington incident. They know what we did." Ice formed in my stomach. "Where are you?" "Hiding. They ransacked my apartment, took all my research." "Eleanor, they have photographs of you, recent ones. They've been documenting your movements for years. Despite my precautions, despite living off-grid and avoiding cameras, they had found ways to capture my image. The threshold remained open." "Listen carefully," Marcus continued. "I found something in their documents. The convergence they're preparing for isn't just about bloodlines. It's about location and timing. The threshold strengthens every 40 years, but it can only fully open at the original site, the place where the first photograph captured one of them." "Where?" I demanded. "That's just it. Not the Harrington estate, not Boston at all. The first threshold opened in London, 1835, during one of the earliest successful photographic experiments. The Harringtons were just one branch of the society. There are others, all working toward the same goal, preparing vessels, maintaining the threshold until the convergence. When? December 18th this year, a full lunar eclipse, the same conditions as in 1835. The journal in my hand suddenly felt heavier, its significance clearer. It wasn't sent as a taunt, but as an invitation. The Society wanted me in London for the convergence. Marcus, get somewhere safe. Use cash. Stay offline. A crash interrupted my instructions. The sound of breaking glass from Marcus's end of the line. "They're here," he whispered. "Eleanor, don't." The line went dead. I packed essentials and fled my cabin that night, driving until dawn before abandoning my car at a bus station. Using cash and a fake ID, I purchased a ticket to New York, where I could lose myself in the anonymity of the city while planning my next move. In a dingy hotel room paid for in cash, I studied Elizabeth Harrington's journal more carefully. Between descriptions of society meetings and ritual preparations were sketches, diagrams of camera modifications and ritual spaces, but also something else. Maps. Specifically maps of London with certain locations marked with photographic plate symbols. One location was circled repeatedly, an address in South Kensington that Elizabeth had labelled The Origin. I had to get to London. Not to run from the Society, but to find this origin site. If the threshold had begun there, perhaps it could also end there. Using connections from my academic past and the last of my emergency funds, I obtained a false passport and booked passage on a cargo ship. Air travel, with its ubiquitous cameras and facial recognition, was too risky. The Atlantic crossing gave me time to study the journal exhaustively. Elizabeth had documented the Society's beliefs in detail, that beings existed in the spaces between moments, in the potential unrealized. That photography had accidentally opened a window to their realm, that these entities desired physical form, permanence in our world, and had been working through human agents for generations to achieve it. Most importantly, she documented how the Society had eventually split into factions, those like Edward Harrington, who sought to control the entities, and those who believed the threshold should be permanently sealed. The ship docked in Southampton on December 10th. With just 8 days until the convergence, I made my way to London, staying in a cash-only hostel in Whitechapel, far from the upscale Kensington address marked in Elizabeth's journal. On December 15th, I finally visited the location, an unassuming townhouse converted into luxury apartments. The building's historical marker indicated it had once belonged to William Fox Talbot, one of photography's pioneers. This had to be where the first threshold opened, where an experimental photograph had accidentally captured something from between moments. As I studied the building from across the street, a black car pulled up. A familiar figure emerged, Marcus. But his movements were wrong, too fluid, his posture too perfect. The entity had taken him again. Our eyes met across the street. He smiled, that unnatural knowing smile, and beckoned me forward. I ran. For 2 days I hid in the labyrinthine streets of London, changing locations frequently, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. The convergence was approaching, and with it, the moment the threshold would open, completely. On the morning of December 18th, I made my decision. I would not run. I would not hide. I would confront the entity, the Society, and the threshold at its source. I returned to Fox Talbot's former home as evening approached. The lunar eclipse would begin in hours. Society members were already gathering, arriving in expensive cars, their faces hidden behind umbrellas despite the clear winter sky. Using service entrances and fire escapes, I infiltrated the building. In the basement, I found what I was looking for, a room transformed into a ritual space identical to the one beneath the Harrington estate. The antique camera stood ready, modified with both historical and cutting-edge components. Around it, Society members in formal attire arranged themselves while Marcus, or the thing wearing him, adjusted the camera. I stepped from the shadows. "You've been waiting for me." The society members turned as one. Among them, I recognized faces from historical photographs, descendants of the original Camera Obscura society, bloodlines carefully maintained across generations. The entity wearing Marcus approached. The vessel arrives willingly. The convergence is complete. Not willingly, I corrected, but I am here to end this, tonight. A woman stepped forward, elderly, aristocratic, with that same penetrating gaze. "You cannot end what has always existed, Eleanor Reeves. We merely provided a window. They have always been there, in the spaces between moments." "Why?" I demanded. "Why manipulate bloodlines for generations? Why prepare vessels?" "Because they showed us what could be," she replied. "A world where time is malleable, where death is merely a frozen moment that can be reframed. They promised immortality, Eleanor. Not just for us, but for all we wish to preserve." I looked around the room, at the faces of people who had dedicated their lives, their entire family histories, to this moment. And the cost? The disappeared photographers? The vessels used and discarded? "Necessary sacrifices," the woman said dismissively. "The convergence requires the perfect vessel. You, Eleanor, Sullivan blood, Harrington blood, born under the right stars, identified at birth. We've been waiting for you for generations." The entity stepped closer. Marcus's face twisted in that unnatural smile. "The threshold opens fully tonight. You will step through willingly, become the permanent doorway. What exists in potential will become real. And if I refuse," the entity gestured to the other society members, "then they will all become temporary vessels, painful, inefficient, but effective, beginning with the one you know as Marcus." I appeared to consider, moving closer to the camera. "What exactly do you need me to do?" The elderly woman stepped forward eagerly. "Simply look into the camera when the eclipse reaches totality. The threshold will open, and you will become the bridge." "That's it? Just look into the camera?" The entity nodded, Marcus's face showing anticipation. I lunged suddenly, grabbing a heavy silver candlestick from a nearby table and swinging it at the camera. The antique device toppled, its glass plates shattering on impact. Chaos erupted. Society members rushed forward as the entity screamed with Marcus's voice, a sound of rage and frustration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But I wasn't finished. From my pocket, I withdrew a small vial of chemicals I'd prepared based on Elizabeth Harrington's journal. Silver nitrate, mixed with other compounds, the original formula that had accidentally opened the first threshold. As hands grabbed at me, I splashed the mixture onto the broken camera and struck a match. The chemicals ignited with a flash that shouldn't have been possible, a blinding light that filled the room. In that moment, as the eclipse reached totality above, the threshold didn't just open, it collapsed. Reality seemed to warp, images from different times overlapping. I saw the original Fox Talbot experiment, the Harrington ritual, countless moments when the threshold had been thinned by photography throughout history, all happening simultaneously. The entity wearing Marcus contorted in agony, its form separating from his body. Around the room, society members with that same penetrating gaze underwent similar transformations, the entities that had been partially inhabiting them for generations being forcibly extracted. "What have you done?" the elderly woman screamed as her eyes returned to normal, the penetrating gaze fading. "Reversed the polarity of the threshold," I explained, helping Marcus to his feet as he regained consciousness. Elizabeth's journal contained the formula. The Society's dissidents had discovered it generations ago, a way to not just close the threshold, but collapse it entirely. The entities, now visible as shifting smoke-like forms, were being pulled toward the burning remains of the camera, drawn back through the collapsing threshold. Their inhuman shrieks filled the room as they desperately sought vessels, any anchor in our reality. Society members fled in terror as the building began to shake. Marcus and I staggered toward the exit, fighting against the pull of the collapsing threshold. Outside, we watched as strange lights flickered behind the windows of Fox Talbot's former home. Then, with a sound like thunder, the phenomenon ended. The eclipse passed, moonlight returned, and the threshold closed, not just temporarily but permanently. In the aftermath, the society disbanded. Without their entity's influence, most members seemed disoriented, as if awakening from a long dream. The few who remained loyal to the cause were left with nothing but broken rituals and shattered ambitions. Marcus recovered fully this time, the entity's influence completely erased from his mind. We parted ways in London, he returning to academia under yet another name, me disappearing into a new life with a new identity. I still avoid photographs. Old habits die hard, and part of me remains vigilant, watching for that penetrating gaze in the eyes of strangers. But for the first time in years, I sleep without fear. The threshold is closed. The spaces between moments remain their own mystery, undisturbed by human ambition or entities seeking form. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened had I looked into that camera during the eclipse. What world might have emerged if potential had become real? What price would reality have paid for such a transformation? I'll never know. And perhaps that's for the best. Some thresholds are not meant to be crossed. Some photographs are better left untaken.